Hey guys, I hope you're all having a fantastic Friday morning. I'm here with Jennifer Dewinter from Worcester Polytechnic Institute. She studies video games, anime, basically anything and everything pop culture. Thank you for coming on, Jennifer.
Thank you.
So, like I said, you studied anime, music, television, all this pop culture, and I think a lot of us would like to know, like, where's your world 1-1? Where did you start? We're like, how did you start down this path of becoming a college professor that studies, video games and stuff? Because it sounds like a pretty cool job.
Yeah, it was accidental. I started college as a math major. I went through my teen years, like most teenagers in the early 90s, kind of enamored with emergent Japanese popular culture coming to America for the first time in this very public way. And so in the mid to late 90s, I switched over to Japanese as my major, moved to Japan with the intention of going to animation school. So I wanted to learn Japanese in order to enroll in school, which I did. Then I came back to the US to get a master's degree because it was easier to get the equivalent of a green card, my visa stamped, if I had a higher degree. I did that. I moved back to Japan. I saw how many people were making significantly more money than me with a PhD. So my original plan was to come back to the US, get a PhD, and then return to Japan. And I originally started my PhD program in 18th century rhetorical history with a focus on the Scottish Enlightenment.
Kind of opposite side of the globe there, huh?
Right. And my first year of graduate school, I had a professor, Ken McAllister, who's a video game scholar in the program. I took his course on the theory and rhetoric of video games, turned to me and said, "You know a lot about anime, video games, and manga. Why don't you research that?" And it blew my mind. I'm like, I did not know that was a thing that you could do. So 100% switched over into video games, manga, and anime, and the trifecta that is that industry. Finished my PhD. In that time, though, I married my husband, and he did not want to live in Japan. And so I joined WPI. Mostly, I took the job because it had interactive media and game development, which is one of the oldest game development programs in the US. Now I direct it, so that's an exciting move for me. And I started the Japanese Project Center. So now we take students from WPI's game development program to Japan for 3 months to work in labs or in game studios.
So you do any work with like Capcom, Square Enix, any of the big ones, Konami?
No, our alumni do, but not for the internships, because the internships are so short and our students don't speak Japanese. And in order to work for those big ones, you have to be able to speak Japanese. So I have to find partners who speak English.
Okay. Indie creates?
Lots of them, yeah. So we have 4 partners in Japan, 2 universities, Itsumeikan University and Osaka University. And then there are 2 indie startups that have now shown at the Tokyo Game Convention that our students have worked on those games. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So like you married your husband, then where does it go from there? Like what does your job entail then? Like I guess how do you study video games? Because like I study video games from more of a historical aspect. I try not to go deep into the cultural aspect, but I am somewhat fascinated by it. But it's also kind of like a taboo thing to talk about on YouTube or with gaming in general.
Yeah.
So like I go from historical because like I always say video games are the best recorded history you can ever get, because you can read an article about what the designers were thinking about when they made this game or this part of the game or this element of the game, and then you go play it and experience that.
Yeah.
And that's
so I come out of the cultural studies side. That's my training, and I ended up in a production program. And so a lot of the projects that I end up doing now are production based. So I work with VR students and AR and so forth. But when I go to study video games themselves, it depends on how I'm studying them. If I'm having to teach a game design class, I'm studying them for game mechanics, experience design, whatever the innovation is,
Mm-hmm.
in order to break it down. And so if I think about a class like the history of gameplay, which I've offered before, and it sounds like magic when I describe it to gamers, and it's in fact not. It's 20 hours a week of hunkering down and playing through the history of games. We start at Choose Your Own Adventure books. We end at the new Nintendo Switch, right? And we're just moving through Mortal Kombat and Sonic the Hedgehog and whatever like the major game from that era is, or whatever is a critical darling, right? It doesn't become successful on the market, but all game designers know it and talk about it, right? So Ico is one of those that very few people play, but game designers love.
Have you do you guys play Shadow of the Colossus then too, or?
I encourage them to. I don't think it's as strong as Ico in terms of being innovative in introducing a new gameplay mechanic.
No, it's not. But like I always say it as like a good pillar for like video games as art.
Yeah, no, it's beautiful.
Oh, yeah.
It's beautiful and it's pensive, and it's that early trope of making you complicit in the evil by following the rules of the game, right? Which is what BioShock does as well, right? Would you kindly
Don't spoil BioShock. Haven't played it.
Oh my gosh, I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. It's on my backlog, but like there's a shelf over there of my backlog of shame, I call it, and it's just chock full. It's chock full. And it's just like, when do you get the time, you know?
Yep. I understand that because I play games at home and I had to stop putting air quotes of research around it. Like, what are you doing? I'm like, I'm researching. I'm actually researching right now. So playing through something like that, I think the challenge of it is that anytime a game comes out, the culture around that game wants to play it the best ever. But if you kind of start playing your way through the history of games, the compulsion to figure out the Easter eggs or the final moves or the secret combinations is much lower, and so students don't aim for mastery as much. And so it really kind of shows you how much kind of this sort of social imperative matters in and around games. And that's why I say it sounds fun until you have to think about hunkering down to master 3 characters' final moves in Mortal Kombat, for example. In terms of kind of cultural studies of games, I came to it from a Japanese studies perspective on industry and media. And a lot of what I end up studying is either kind of the 3 major industries of Japan, manga, anime, and video games, which are so closely entwined. We tend to pull them apart and talk about them separately, and we shouldn't be. And so if you start putting them together and considering how they're influencing each other, all of a sudden certain questions that you might ask of one medium make sense in the context of another medium. And more and more in the last 10 years, I've been moving toward industry analysis, international trade, industry analysis of Japanese objects in East Asian markets or in the US market, or in the case of Rapeplay, everywhere. And how that puts pressure on policies, on trade agreements, on economic industrial practices, any of those things. Because I find that my students, at least, are very good at talking about people who make games, and they're very good at talking about people who play games, and they're very bad at talking about the people who distribute games. And when you consider that for a long time, when Kotaku used to run its most powerful people in the game industry list, I don't know if you remember that list, always the buyer for Walmart was in the top 10.
Okay.
And so if you don't start considering distribution,
yeah,
international trade agreements and those sorts of things, and understand how that not only affects how you get your game out there, but actually the content of the game, you're not prepping yourself well for a market.
So like, I guess I'm trying to think where we can go from there. Like, So you're talking about more about the marketing of gamings and all that. Like, have you found it kind of interesting though how, like in the '90s and early 2000s, Japanese games were so huge,
Uh-huh.
and you couldn't set foot. Like Final Fantasy VII brought RPGs into the limelight and was the one that basically popularized RPGs for the casual audience. But now, like you're seeing more and more Western studios or European studios come in and take that limelight. So what do you think of that?
Yeah, I in fact wrote a chapter on this. So I'm finishing up a book on Final Fantasy VII, so this is a funny question.
Oh, yeah, you are now, huh?
It's 2 years late, so I'm feeling apologetic. Sorry, Mark Wolf. So I think when you start talking about origin of games and origin uh, of kind of modes of play or of the companies, it starts getting really tricky, right? So if you think about Final Fantasy VII launching what's considered the JRPG era of games, right? Like these big sprawling games of kind of ensemble casts, massive narratives, right? Like that's the JRPG. It's based on D&D. The first JRPG is by an American who moves to Japan, designs Black Onyx based upon hanging out in Hawaii and playing D&D with his friends. And so how much of that sensibility is Japanese and how much of it is US, right? So I think when you start looking at that massive influx, part of it is that there's this dearth in the US market in the late 90s. Part of that was a direct result of the competition between Nintendo and Sega, right? And that's this moment where games become masculinized. Before that, they're firmly in the family. They're firmly gender neutral in many ways.
Nintendo, if we're
Well,
gonna be honest.
most of the early games, right? Like even if you look at not all Atari, because of course there's Custer's Last Stand, right? But most of the early games are really open to almost everyone. So you have Pac-Man, you have Miss Pac-Man, you have Adventure, you have many things, right? I have firm memories of being in the 80s and women and men crowded around the Gauntlet arcade, right? So Sega has to be the little fish in a big pond of Nintendo. How do you bifurcate the market and then win part of that market? You start this masculinizing process.
They chose choice. And Sega was choice. Nintendo was more like, okay, we're going to be family friendly, and then Sega was choice. I got that from Console Wars from Blake J. Harris. You read his book?
It's choice, and it's power. Sega is all about masculine power. If you go back and watch all of the old ads, the old television ads, or read any of the magazine ads, it's all about like turbo power, race cars, NASCAR, whatever, right? Like the focus is always on the power of the image, the power of the speed, the power of the black box, right?
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden it starts shifting US consumer culture. Meanwhile, Nintendo pisses off Sony.
Yeah.
And they create the PlayStation, and the PlayStation is highly successful, right? PlayStation 2 is still best-selling console ever.
PlayStation 4 at 75 million units sold right now. I mean, it's ridiculous.
And so they create this thing, and that's where we see the JRPG and the big Japanese influx come to the US. It's not via the Nintendo games, even though they're made in Japan. They don't have what's called cultural odor. We don't think, oh, Mario, Japan, or Zelda, Japan. They're kind of cultural neutral. And by cultural neutral, I mean they read as American white. Yeah. Instead, you have this PlayStation marketing to the Japanese market and working with this technology and just allowing size to take over. And so some of it's that. Some of it is that already in the con scene, anime had seen a huge bump up in popularity via if you went to like a gaming convention, there was always an anime room, and they always had fan subbed anime. And
Yeah.
I'm old now, so I remember the era of partial subs, and so that's what people would go to these rooms to watch. Is like sometimes it would be subtitled, and sometimes it wouldn't be, whatever, right? But everyone was watching it, and it popped up demand. So all of a sudden, it pushed licensing, right? That licensing then pushed demand for the Japanese games, but things that had to read like Japanese games, like Japanese anime type games, which is also part of what pushes the JRPG, in a way that it doesn't push some of these other things. So I think that era is super interesting, just in terms of like how Japan is able to enter the US market. And then simultaneously, you can ask the same sorts of questions of why Xbox cannot enter the Japan market. And part of it has to do with this this type of not unified approach to what American culture can be and be consumed, right? So we're consuming anime, manga, JRPG, Japanese, clearly delineated Japanese video games all simultaneously, and the markets drive each other.
Yeah.
I feel like I got off topic. I do that.
A little bit, but it was interesting, to hear that and all that, because it's true. You saw this rise of JRPGs, and then it was like a perfect storm, because at that time Dragon Ball was hitting its height, and a bunch of other animes started coming over because they realized there's a market there, and then okay, well now here's a JRPG like Final Fantasy VII, and it just blew up. It was amazing because it was just this cultural storm of people that weren't just nerds in the back dubbing their own anime and watching it. It was now open to the mass markets, and that helped drive sales and all that.
Well, and Cartoon Network helped that, right?
Yeah.
Like, if you talk about perfect storm and distribution networks, how does that all happen? It happens because Cartoon Network has Vampire Hunter D, Robot Carnival, and one other anime movie I'm blanking on, all show in this one block. And
Toonami.
No, it's before Toonami. It's mid 90s, and it starts the Japanese wave. And everyone actually recognizes this moment with Cartoon Network normalizing the desire for Japanese as a consumable thing.